Asia and so on, ISIS, are highly unlikely to have their own people in northern Kurdistan, in southwest Turkey. So there's a very good chance, I think, that they're relying on the Turkish intelligence sources for their information. Now, to rely on Turkey to give you accurate information about anything to do with Kurdish resistance or the Kurdish liberation struggle is simply a joke. No one would suggest that Turkey is going to give you any kind of objective view. So we argued that the information that Australia is using to make its decision is simply not believable, not plausible. Thirdly, we said that the PKK poses no threat to Australia or Australians, or Australian interests, if you like. There's really no suggestion, no credible suggestion, I think, that that's the case. I don't think there's any documented evidence of the PKK ever harming Australians. Certainly they don't make any attempt to bring the conflict that is being waged over there here. Interestingly, when the relisting of the PKK was confirmed this year, the committee did respond to, or did ask the security agencies for further comments about the threat to Australians that they alleged was the case. And the security agencies came back and said, oh no, there is a threat to Australians because Australians do love to travel, so they may be in Turkey as tourists. The PKK is taking its campaign into urban centres, highly debatable I think, such as Istanbul and Ankara, and therefore there's some risk to Australians who could happen to find themselves in those places and the victim of violence instigated by the PKK. Now, you judge for yourself whether that's a credible threat to Australia or not. I would suggest not. If that was seen as a threat, then all kinds of activities around the world which do actually harm Australians might need to be thought of in a different way. The fourth point we made was that the PKK is properly understood as a national liberation movement, a legitimate national liberation movement. As both John and Heval mentioned, the PKK has evolved as a political organisation. Its ideology these days as I understand it, centres on, or is based on three central principles: grassroots democracy, pluralist and multi-ethnic, multicultural approach. One. Two, an absolute commitment to the empowerment of women, as was been talked about. And three, a very strong belief in ecology, environment. Now those beliefs, as they're expressed by the PKK, are arguably radical and indeed revolutionary, and they're great for that. But I don't think anyone could argue that they're extremist or violently extremist, the kind of ideology that's usually propounded by terrorists. A large segment of the Australian population would identify as feminist, perhaps not in exactly the same way as comrades in Kurdistan, but these ideas are not anathema to Australians and the Australian population. Another angle is that, as has been mentioned, the PKK is of course allied to the forces in northern Syria, in Rojava, which are very active there. The PYD, the political party in northern Syria that's very close to the PKK, not the same thing of course, but close, forming part of the same ideological movement broadly. It's that party and that movement for a democratic society, which has led to the upsurge of activity and given the capacity in that area to resist and ultimately overcome the terrible and real terrorist organisations of ISIS and other Islamist groups over there. So it's the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, largely led by Kurds, largely populated by Kurds, Kurdish people, from those political movements, which has fought ISIS and beaten ISIS in that area, with the support, ironically enough, and in some forms, of the US military. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, you could argue, for the Australian state to ban a political entity, political movement, which is closely allied with the movement in Syria, which has in fact defeated ISIS. One point that I should have made earlier is that there are now, I think, 25 organisations banned as terrorist organisations in Australia. All of them, without exception, are, all of them with one exception, are extremist Islamist organisations. The one exception is the PKK, of course, which has nothing to do with those other organisations and their beliefs. The sixth point we made was that the PKK has significant support in the Australian community, both among progressive Australians, I would think, some people here tonight, and of course among the Kurdish community. As Heval said, the PKK is the representative body, the driving force behind the Kurdish struggle for liberation, the Kurdish struggle for autonomy. So to say that the PKK is some sort of extremist or splinter group without support in Australia is simply absurd. And the risk is that by banning an organisation like that, people in Australia who have no history of violence or anything like that are prevented from expressing their political beliefs, communicating their political beliefs, and joining and supporting an organisation that they would like to support. This is actually quite a touchy point, it would seem, for the Parliamentary Committee, which has made comments along the lines of that the ban does not prevent people in Australia, particularly Kurdish communities, from expressing their beliefs, from communicating their political beliefs. But the evidence is, I think, and I've heard this from Kurdish comrades, that the very fact that the PKK is banned as a terrorist organisation impacts on their lives, their relations with people, other Australians, neighbours, their kids at school, in the workplace, for example. They're open to discrimination and abuse simply because they support the Kurdish liberation movement and the PKK as the representative of that and driver of that movement, which is banned, as I said. We also noted in our submission and in this brochure that the PKK was the driving force behind the attempt to establish peace talks in Turkey. So, again, many of you are probably familiar with this. 2015, I think, there was a movement towards peace, a cessation of hostilities. Mr. Öcalan made an appeal for the PKK to halt its campaign. There was discussion about the PKK withdrawing to outside the borders of the nation-state of Turkey, and that discussion was underway for some months. Ultimately, it was ended unilaterally by the Turkish state. There were attempts to undermine it prior to that, and after some time, the government, led by Erdogan, basically gave up on the peace, the attempted peace talks. It suited Erdogan at the time to move to a far more nationalistic rhetoric. His party was electorally under threat at the time. The party which represents many Kurdish aspirations, the electoral party in Turkey, was doing very well. Elections were pending, and so Erdogan and his party and others in Turkey decided to, and quite deliberately, I think, in cold blood, to rekindle the conflict, end the discussions around peace. So it was clearly their decision